When we first moved into that quiet little neighborhood, I thought I had found a dream come true. You know, the kind of place where kids ride their bikes on sunny afternoons, neighbors wave from their porches, and everyone knows each other's name. The houses were big and beautiful, with shiny green lawns and white fences that lined the streets like something straight out of a magazine. It was supposed to be a fresh start for my family, a safe place where we could breathe, relax, and live without worries. But more than anything, I wanted it to be a happy place for Buddy, our big, fluffy golden retriever, who was more than just a pet. He was my best friend, my comfort when I felt anxious, the reason I could get out of bed on my hardest days. Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was family. He had this way of looking at you with his big brown eyes, soft as melted chocolate, and in that gaze it was like he knew exactly how you were feeling. If I was sad, Buddy would lay his head gently on my lap, wagging his tail slowly, like he was saying, "It's okay, I'm here." If I was happy, he would jump and twirl around, spinning in circles until we both laughed so hard we couldn't breathe. Buddy loved everyone. He loved kids, neighbors, mailmen, even cats that crossed his path. I used to say he didn't have a mean bone in his body, and that was true. Every morning, we'd go for a long walk around the neighborhood, and people would smile at Buddy because he was so friendly, always trotting by my side like my shadow. Sometimes kids in the street would run over just to pet him, their tiny hands buried in his soft fur. Watching Buddy with them made my heart swell. For the first few weeks, it seemed like everything was perfect, like we had found a place where Buddy could be loved by everyone, and where I could finally breathe easy. But if life has taught me anything, it's that sometimes, when things seem too perfect, trouble is just waiting around the corner. It started small. One day, I found a note in our mailbox. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper. It said, "Your dog is too big for this neighborhood. Keep him quiet." I remember staring at that note, my hands trembling. I laughed nervously at first because it felt like some kind of bad joke. Buddy? Too big? Too noisy? Buddy hardly ever barked. He was a gentle giant, the kind of dog that would rather lick someone's face than growl at them. But the note was just the beginning. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, telling myself it was probably some grumpy neighbor having a bad day. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. Then, about a week later, while Buddy and I were out for our morning walk, I noticed a man standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, watching us. He had sharp eyes that seemed to follow our every move, and when Buddy wagged his tail at him, hoping for a friendly hello, the man just sneered and turned away. I brushed it off, but that same day, when I got home, there was a warning letter from the HOA slipped under our door. It said Buddy was a nuisance, and that we had 7 days to fix the problem or face a fine. My heart dropped. How could they say that about Buddy? What problem? I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I tried to calm down and remind myself that misunderstandings happen. Maybe someone heard another dog barking and blamed Buddy by mistake. So I decided to do the neighborly thing. I went to the next HOA meeting to talk about it. I even brought Buddy with me on a leash, hoping that when people saw how sweet he was, they'd realize there was no issue. But when I walked into that meeting room, holding Buddy's leash tight, I could feel the stares. Cold, hard eyes following us as we found a seat in the corner. I introduced myself and Buddy, tried to sound calm even though my heart was racing. I explained how gentle Buddy was, how he was even certified as an emotional support animal. I thought, for sure, if they just listened, they'd understand. But the head of the HOA, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Green, didn't even let me finish. She interrupted me, her voice sharp like a knife. "We don't allow dogs of that size here. Period." I blinked at her, confused. I had read the HOA handbook back and forth when we moved in. Nowhere did it say anything about dog size limits. But there's nothing in the rules about big dogs. I said softly, trying to stay polite. She just smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach twist into knots. "We'll be updating those rules soon," she said, like it was already decided. I looked around the room, hoping someone would speak up for me. For Buddy, some of my neighbors avoided my gaze. Others looked down at their laps like they were afraid. And in that moment, I realized something that made my heart sink even deeper. This wasn't just about Buddy. This was about control, about power, and about people like Mrs. Green who wanted to make the rules and crush anyone who didn't fit into their perfect little picture. I walked out of that meeting with Buddy by my side, his head down like he could feel my sadness. But as I held his leash tighter, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them take Buddy away from me. The days that followed were like walking on broken glass. Every time I stepped outside with Buddy, I could feel the eyes on us, watching, judging, waiting for us to make a mistake. People who used to smile at me now looked away or crossed the street when they saw us coming. Even kids who used to run up to pet Buddy were now being pulled back by their parents, who whispered things behind my back. And all because of a few people in the HOA who decided Buddy wasn't welcome. Then came the first fine, a bright yellow envelope taped to my door like a badge of shame. Inside, a letter saying I owed $500 for violating community pet policies, even though no such policy about dog size existed. I remember sitting on the floor, Buddy curled up next to me, as I read that letter over and over, trying to make sense of it. How could they fine me for breaking a rule that didn't exist? I felt like I was losing my mind. Buddy licked my hand, like he was telling me it would be okay. But deep down, I knew it wasn't okay. Not at all. I called the HOA office the next day, hoping to speak calmly and clear things up, but when I got Mrs. Green on the phone, her voice was cold as ice. "If you don't like the rules, maybe this isn't the right community for you," she said, and hung up before I could even reply. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, stunned. Was she trying to bully me out of my own home? I thought about moving. But then I looked at Buddy and my heart broke. This was his home, too. He loved running in the backyard, watching birds, sitting on the porch with me. How could I take that away from him? That night, as I sat in the dark, I made a decision. I was going to fight. I didn't know how yet, but I wasn't going to let them scare me away. I wasn't going to let them hurt Buddy. I knew there had to be others in the neighborhood who loved dogs too. People who had stayed silent because they were scared of the HOA. I decided I would find them. I would show them we didn't have to be afraid. But just as I was feeling a little stronger, another note appeared in my mailbox the next morning. This one wasn't typed like the others. It was handwritten, messy, almost like someone was angry when they wrote it. It said, "Get rid of the dog, or we'll make sure you both regret it." And that's when I realized this was only the beginning. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that ugly, threatening note in my mind, as if the letters were burned into my brain. "Get rid of the dog, or we'll make sure you both regret it." Who could write something so cruel about Buddy? I kept telling myself it had to be a misunderstanding, that maybe some neighbor was just having a bad day. But deep down, I knew better. There was something darker happening here. Buddy lay next to me, his big head resting on my feet, like he always did when he knew I was upset. I reached down and ran my fingers through his soft fur, and for a moment, I let myself cry. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. How could anyone hate such a sweet dog? The next morning, I decided to take Buddy out for a walk like we always did. I wasn't going to let fear win. But as soon as we stepped outside, I felt it. The tension, thick in the air like a storm about to break. Mrs. Green was standing at the corner, pretending to check her mail, but I could see her watching us out the corner of her eye. A man I'd never seen before was standing on his porch, arms crossed, glaring at Buddy like he was some kind of monster. And then, as we walked past one of the houses, a woman stepped outside and, without even saying a word, slammed her door so hard it made Buddy jump. My heart ached for him. He didn't understand why people were suddenly being so mean. I felt like I was walking in a neighborhood full of strangers, and I missed the way it had been when we first moved in, warm, friendly, safe. But what happened next made everything worse. As we walked past Mrs. Green's house, Buddy stopped to sniff the grass like he always did. I wasn't even looking when suddenly I heard her sharp, angry voice, "Get your beast off my lawn." I turned to her, shocked. "He's not hurting anything," I said gently, trying to keep the peace. But she took a step closer, her face red with anger. "I've told you before. If I see that dog on my property again, I'll call animal control." My heart stopped. Animal control? Like Buddy was some kind of dangerous stray? I wanted to shout at her to defend Buddy, but I knew yelling would only make it worse. So I took a deep breath, tugged Buddy's leash gently, and walked away. But my hands were shaking, and I could feel tears burning in my eyes. When we got home, I sat on the porch, hugging Buddy tightly. He nuzzled my face, licking away the tears I didn't even know were falling. "It's okay, Buddy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure that was true. How could it be okay when people were threatening to take him away from me? That afternoon, I decided to reach out to a few neighbors, people I thought might understand. I messaged Mr. Johnson, an older man down the street who always smiled at Buddy when we passed. I also texted Sarah, a mom with 2 kids who used to play with Buddy every chance they got. But when Mr. Johnson replied, my heart sank. He said, "I'm sorry I can't get involved. I've already had trouble with the HOA." Sarah didn't even reply at all. It felt like we were completely alone. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I sat down and wrote a letter to the HOA board, carefully explaining how Buddy was an emotional support animal and how he wasn't causing any problems. I added photos of Buddy playing gently with neighborhood kids, hoping it would show them how sweet he really was. I printed out copies and slipped them under the doors of every HOA board member, hoping someone would have a heart. But days passed, and there was no reply. Instead, when I checked my mail later that week, there was another fine, $1,000 this time, and a notice that if Buddy wasn't removed within 30 days, legal action would begin. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Removed? Buddy wasn't some piece of furniture they could just throw away. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fine notice, and for the first time, I felt real fear. What if they actually tried to take Buddy? What if they used animal control to force him away? What if they took me to court and made me choose between my home and my best friend? I looked over at Buddy, who was lying in his bed, fast asleep, his tail thumping softly as he dreamed. I couldn't let that happen. I had to find a way to stop them. The next day, I started doing research. I read everything I could find about HOA rules, emotional support animals, and the law. I learned that under the Fair Housing Act, they couldn't just kick Buddy out because of his size or breed, especially if he was my emotional support animal. But reading about my rights and actually fighting an HOA were 2 very different things. HOAs have lawyers and money, and they know how to scare people into doing what they want. I was just one person, and I didn't know if I could stand up to them alone. But when I looked at Buddy, I knew I had to try. I decided to call a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Ms. Carter, and she had a reputation for fighting back against unfair HOAs. When I first explained what was happening, she was quiet for a moment, and I was scared she wouldn't take my case. But then she said, "You're not the first person they've tried to bully, and I bet you won't be the last. Let's fight this." I felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Ms. Carter explained that we could send a formal letter demanding that the HOA stop harassing me and Buddy, and if they didn't, we could take legal action. But as good as that sounded, she also warned me, they're going to fight back hard. Sure enough, she was right. The very next day after Ms. Carter sent her letter, I found a dead rat thrown onto my porch. My stomach turned when I saw it. A message, loud and clear. Someone wanted to scare me. I called the police, but they said unless I saw who did it, there wasn't much they could do. I was furious. Buddy stood next to me, growling softly, his ears back. It was the first time I had ever seen him act like that, and it broke my heart that he felt scared too. But I didn't give up. Ms. Carter helped me file an official complaint against the HOA, and she started gathering evidence. I took photos of everything, the notes, the fines, even the dead rat. I kept records of every time Mrs. Green or anyone else said something rude about Buddy. And slowly, I started to find people who were willing to help. One night, when I was walking Buddy after dark, Sarah finally stopped me. She looked around nervously, like she was scared someone would see us talking. "I'm sorry I didn't answer before," she whispered, "but I think what they're doing to you is wrong." She told me that her kids miss Buddy and asked if there was anything she could do to help. I almost cried with relief. Maybe we weren't as alone as I thought. Together, we started reaching out to other neighbors quietly. People who were tired of the HOA's bullying but had been too scared to say anything. One by one, people started opening up. Mr. Johnson even came over one evening and said, "You know, when I first moved here, they did something similar to me. I wish I had fought back like you're doing." Little by little, we were building a small army of people who wanted to see Buddy stay. But just when I thought things might start to get better, something happened that shook me to my core. One morning, I woke up to find my front gate open. Buddy, who always stayed close to home, was nowhere in sight. My heart stopped. I called his name over and over, running down the street like a crazy person, but there was no sign of him. My sweet Buddy, gone. And that's when I realized someone had let him out on purpose. I ran down every street in our neighborhood, screaming Buddy's name like my life depended on it. My throat burned and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't care. I checked under every bush, behind every fence, even knocked on doors I had never dared before, begging people to tell me if they'd seen him. Most people just stared at me coldly, shaking their heads. One woman even muttered under her breath, "Maybe it's for the best. That dog didn't belong here anyway." I wanted to scream at her, but I was too focused on finding Buddy to waste time arguing. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone as I called animal control, praying he hadn't been picked up already. The woman on the phone sounded bored, like I was just another person on her list. "No dog matching that description has been brought in yet," she said flatly. Her words made my stomach twist. Yet, like it was only a matter of time. As I stood there in the middle of the street, tears rolling down my face, Ms. Carter called. I could barely get the words out as I told her what happened. "They took him. I know they did." I sobbed. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Listen, I'm going to come over, and we're going to figure this out." Somehow, hearing her calm voice helped me breathe again. But as soon as I hung up, I looked around and noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Green was standing in her window, watching me, with a tiny smirk on her face. It was like she was enjoying my pain. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew, without a doubt, she had something to do with Buddy's disappearance. Still, I couldn't accuse her without proof. I wiped my face and started knocking on more doors. This time, I wasn't asking politely. "Did you see who opened my gate? Did you see anyone take Buddy?" I asked every person I could find. Most of them just shook their heads and shut their doors. But when I got to Mr. Johnson's house, he hesitated before speaking. "I didn't want to get involved," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "But I saw someone by your gate early this morning." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Mr. Johnson looked down at the ground. "I think it was one of the HOA board members, that tall guy, Mr. Fields." I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, hearing that name made my blood boil. Mr. Fields, the same board member who had signed a letter threatening me with legal action if Buddy wasn't removed. My hands curled into fists, but I knew I couldn't just go storming over there without a plan. I thanked Mr. Johnson and hurried back home, just as Miss Carter pulled up in her car. When she saw my face, she didn't waste time on small talk. "Let's sit down," she said firmly, leading me inside. Once we were in the kitchen, she pulled out her laptop and started typing furiously. "We're going to draft an emergency cease and desist letter," she explained. "If they took your dog, we'll make it very clear that you're ready to sue." But even as she worked, I couldn't stop pacing. Every time I thought about Buddy out there, alone and scared, my heart shattered all over again. What if they hurt him? I whispered, my voice breaking. Miss Carter looked up from her laptop, her eyes kind but serious. "We're not going to let that happen," she promised. Still, her words couldn't erase the image in my mind. Buddy, trapped somewhere, maybe cold and hungry, waiting for me to find him. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there. As soon as Miss Carter finished the letter, I knew my next step. I decided I was going to confront Mr. Fields, not to accuse him outright, but to see his reaction, to look him in the eyes and see if he would give himself away. Ms. Carter warned me be careful, but I was beyond caring. I was fueled by pure desperation. I walked to his house, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. When I knocked on his door, it took a while before he answered. And when he did, his face was a mask of fake politeness. "Oh, hello," he said smoothly. "Can I help you?" I forced myself to speak calmly, though my hand was shaking. "Buddy is missing. Someone opened my gate. I was hoping maybe you saw something." His eyes flickered, just for a second, and then he smiled that slimy fake smile. "No, I haven't seen your dog. But honestly, maybe it's for the best. He was a danger to the neighborhood." My mouth dropped open in shock. "He's never hurt anyone." I shot back, my voice rising. Mr. Fields shrugged. "Maybe not yet, but you never know with dogs like that." And then, as if to twist a knife, he added, "Sometimes things have a way of working themselves out." I wanted to scream at him, but I forced myself to keep it together. I thanked him through gritted teeth and walked away. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A tuft of buddies were stuck to the corner of Mr. Fields' fence. My breath caught. I recognized that fur anywhere, soft and golden, the exact color of Buddy's coat. My hand started to shake again, but this time with anger. That was proof, or at least a clue. I took out my phone and snapped a picture, making sure to capture every detail. I was going to show this to Ms. Carter as soon as I got home. When I got back, Ms. Carter was still at the table, looking over papers. As soon as I showed her the photo, her eyes narrowed. "Good. Now we have something," she said firmly. She picked up her phone and started calling someone, a private investigator, she explained, to dig deeper into Mr. Fields and the other HOA members. "If they took Buddy, we'll find out where he is," she promised. Hearing her determination gave me a tiny sliver of hope. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining Buddy out there, all alone. Every little sound outside made me jump, hoping it was him scratching at the door, trying to get back home. I left food and water out on the porch, praying he would come back. But the porch stayed empty, and every hour that passed made my heart sink lower. I sat on the floor next to his empty bed, clutching one of his favorite toys, a little stuffed fox he carried everywhere. I held it tight, as if somehow holding it could bring him back. Just as the sun was coming up, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Carter. "We may have a lead. Don't lose hope." My hands trembled as I read those words over and over. A lead. Maybe, just maybe, Buddy was still out there, waiting for me to find him. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, my head pounding from lack of sleep, when Ms. Carter showed up again, this time with a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, with sharp eyes that looked like they didn't miss a thing, and he carried a leather folder under his arm. "This is Mr. Blake," Ms. Carter said. "He's a private investigator. He may be able to help us figure out what happened to Buddy." Mr. Blake nodded at me, his expression serious. "I've dealt with crooked HOAs before," he said. "If they took your dog, we'll get to the bottom of it." Hearing those words filled me with a flicker of hope, but I couldn't let myself believe too much yet. Not until I had Buddy back in my arms. We sat down and Mr. Blake started asking me questions. When was the last time I saw Buddy? Had anyone made threats before? And who in the HOA had been the most aggressive? I told him everything, especially about Mr. Fields and that awful comment about things working themselves out. Mr. Blake wrote everything down carefully, and when I showed him the photo of Buddy's fur caught on Mr. Fields' fence, he looked at it closely and nodded. "That's a start," he said. But then he leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was about to share a secret. "From what I've seen in cases like this, people like Mr. Fields don't work alone. If he took Buddy, I bet someone else knows about it. Maybe even helped." The thought made my skin crawl. More than one person involved? That meant Buddy could be hidden anywhere, and they were all working together to keep him away from me. My hand started shaking again, but Mr. Blake reached over and put a calming hand on mine. "We'll find him," he said firmly, "but I'm going to need to do some digging." He stood up, adjusting his coat. "First, I'll pay a visit to Mr. Fields, but not to accuse him, just to make him nervous. See what slips." As he left, Ms. Carter turned to me and gave me a small smile. "We're not giving up," she said softly. But as soon as they were gone, I felt the walls closing in again. My house felt too quiet without Buddy's happy barking. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, holding Buddy's leash in my lap. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Blake had said, that someone else might be involved. Who would hate Buddy enough to help Mr. Fields do something so awful? My mind went to Mrs. Green, who had smirked at me from her window. And what about Mr. Keller, another HOA board member who had always looked at Buddy like he was some kind of monster? The thought that people I saw every day, people who smiled in my face, could be behind this made my stomach twist. A few hours later, just as the sun was starting to set, Miss Carter called me again. "You need to come to my office. Now." Her voice was tight, like she was trying not to sound panicked. My heart dropped. Did something happen? Did they find Buddy? I asked, my voice shaking. She paused for a moment before answering. "Just come. You need to see this." I grabbed my coat and ran out the door, my heart thumping in my chest the whole way there. When I arrived, she was standing outside waiting for me, her arms crossed tightly, her face pale. "Come on," she said, motioning me inside quickly. Once we were in her office, she locked the door behind us, which instantly made me nervous. She sat me down and opened her laptop, turning the screen toward me. Blake recorded his meeting with Mr. Fields. She said quietly, "You need to hear this." She hit play, and Mr. Fields' voice filled the room. At first, he was calm, answering Mr. Blake's questions like nothing was wrong. But then Blake asked about Buddy. There was a long pause, and then Mr. Fields said something that made my heart stop. "Look, it's not like the dog's dead or anything. We just handled it. HOA's got to do what's best for the neighborhood." I gasped, covering my mouth. He admitted it. He knew where Buddy was. He had done something. Ms. Carter hit pause and looked at me. "It's not enough to go to the police just yet, but it's close. We need to catch him in the act, or get one of the other HOA members to talk." I could barely breathe. But what if something happens to Buddy while we're waiting? I whispered. Ms. Carter's eyes softened. "We're going to move fast. I promise." Just then, Mr. Blake texted her. "Meet me in 20 minutes. I have something else." Ms. Carter read it out loud and stood up quickly. "Come on. You're coming too." We drove in tense silence to a small diner on the edge of town. Mr. Blake was already there, sitting in a booth, looking more serious than ever. When we sat down, he slid a small USB drive across the table. "You're going to want to hear this," he said. I was leaving Field's place when I overheard him on a call with Mrs. Green. My blood ran cold. What did she say? I asked, my throat dry. Mr. Blake took a deep breath. She was asking if the mutt had been taken far enough that he couldn't find his way back. Field said, "Yeah, he's out at Keller's property in the woods. No way he's coming back." Tears filled my eyes. Buddy was alive, but he was being kept somewhere far away. Ms. Carter squeezed my hand. This is what we needed. Now we can act. But before I could say a word, Mr. Blake looked at me, his eyes serious. "If we go out there now, they'll know we're onto them. We need a plan. Something that won't make them hide Buddy even farther away." I swallowed hard. I knew he was right. But every part of me screamed to just run out there and bring Buddy home. I clenched my fists, trying to think. What kind of plan? I asked, my voice hoarse. Mr. Blake gave me a half smile. Something sneaky. Something they'll never see coming. I sat there staring at Mr. Blake, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of my chest. What kind of sneaky plan? I asked again, this time a little louder, feeling the desperation rising inside me. Mr. Blake leaned in close, glancing around to make sure no one in the diner was listening. "We're going to make them think everything is fine," he said slowly. "Meanwhile, we'll set a trap to catch them in the act of hiding Buddy." I blinked confused. But how do we do that? They already know I'm looking for him. Ms. Carter looked at Mr. Blake, then back at me. "We'll use what we know to scare them into moving Buddy," she explained. "If we can figure out when and where they're moving him, we'll be there to catch them and get Buddy back." My head was spinning, but I nodded slowly. It was risky, but what other choice did I have? Sitting around waiting wasn't going to bring Buddy home. Mr. Blake pulled out his phone and showed me a text draft. I'm going to pretend to be one of their friends, someone on their side, and text Mrs. Green, warning her that I overheard people talking about Buddy in the HOA. He smirked a little. If she thinks the secret's out, she'll panic and call Mr. Fields. They'll try to move Buddy before anyone finds him. A tiny flicker of hope sparked in my chest. If this worked, I could finally see Buddy again. But fear still gnawed at me. What if they move him even farther away? What if they hurt him to cover their tracks? My voice broke as I said the words, and tears welled up in my eyes again. Ms. Carter put a hand on my shoulder. "That's why we'll be ready," she said firmly. "We'll follow them, quietly. They won't know we're watching." Mr. Blake stood up. "We'll need 2 cars," he said. "One to follow, one as backup." He looked at me. "Are you up for this? It could get dangerous." I didn't even hesitate. "I'm in. I need to get Buddy back." With that, we left the diner and went straight to work. Mr. Blake sent a fake message to Mrs. Green, and we waited, tense and silent, for a reply. It took only 5 minutes before her response came in. "Who told you that? If anyone finds out, we're all screwed. I'm calling Bill Fields now." Mr. Blake smirked. "Hook, line, and sinker," he whispered. He looked at me and Ms. Carter. "We need to move. Now." My stomach churned with nerves. This is it, I thought. We're finally close. We jumped into Ms. Carter's car, and Mr. Blake followed in his own. I clutched my phone tightly as we drove toward Mr. Fields' neighborhood. Every second felt like an hour, my mind spinning with thoughts of Buddy. Was he scared? Was he cold? Did he think I had abandoned him? The thought made my chest ache. As we neared the HOA office, we parked just far enough away to not be seen, but close enough to watch. A few minutes later, Mrs. Green's car pulled up, and she rushed inside. Mr. Blake was on the phone, whispering updates to us. "They're talking fast. Can't catch all of it, but they're definitely panicking," he said. "Wait, hold on. She just said, we need to move him tonight. Too risky to wait." My eyes widened. Tonight, this was really happening. About 10 minutes later, Mrs. Green stormed out of the office, and just behind her came Mr. Fields, looking angrier than ever. They climbed into separate cars and sped off. Mr. Blake gave a sharp nod from his car. "Let's go." We followed them carefully, staying far enough behind so they wouldn't notice. My hands were sweaty, and I kept wiping them on my jeans as I watched their taillights. After a long drive out of town, they turned onto a narrow dirt road, one I recognized. It led to Mr. Keller's property. My heart dropped. Buddy was there, somewhere in those woods. We parked a little ways back, hiding behind some trees. From where we were, we could see them talking near a shed in the middle of the property. I squinted, trying to see if Buddy was there, but it was too dark. "We'll wait until they move him," Mr. Blake whispered. "Then we follow." Suddenly, Mrs. Green pulled open the shed door, and I gasped. There he was, Buddy, my beautiful dog, tied up his head low, looking tired and scared. Tears streamed down my face as I watched him. "He's alive. He's alive." But before I could move, Ms. Carter grabbed my arm. "Not yet. If we go now, they'll hide him again." Mr. Fields and Mrs. Green started arguing. We couldn't hear every word, but it was clear something wasn't going as planned. Mr. Blake grinned. "They're cracking under pressure," he said. Suddenly, they both looked around nervously, like they felt someone watching. I held my breath, praying they didn't spot us. Then, Mr. Fields yanked Buddy's leash and dragged him toward his car. Buddy tried to resist, but he was too tired. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up. "Just a little longer," Mr. Blake whispered. "We need to catch them loading him in." Sure enough, as soon as Mr. Fields opened his trunk to shove Buddy inside, Mr. Blake sprang into action. He strode out of the shadows, his phone recording, and called out loudly, caught red-handed Mr. Fields. Mrs. Green gasped and took a step back, while Mr. Fields spun around, his face pale. "What are you doing here?" "You're trespassing," he barked, but Mr. Blake didn't flinch. "No, "You're the one who's in trouble," he said coolly. "Taking someone's dog is a crime." At that moment, Ms. Carter called the police on speakerphone. "Yes, I'd like to report a stolen dog. We have proof and the thieves on site," she said, her voice shaking but strong. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran forward and dropped to my knees next to Buddy. "Buddy, it's me, it's okay," I whispered, tears pouring down my face. Buddy looked up, and when he realized it was me, he let out a weak, happy bark and licked my hands. "I'm here, baby. I'm here," I sobbed, wrapping my arms around him. Mr. Fields shouted something, but I wasn't listening. All that mattered was Buddy, safe in my arms. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As the sound of sirens echoed through the night, Mr. Blake leaned in and whispered, "Now we've got them." As the police cars pulled up, red and blue lights flashing across the dark field, I held Buddy tightly, feeling his little heart pounding fast against mine. The officers jumped out, and when they saw Mr. Fields still holding the leash, their eyes narrowed. One officer stepped forward, asking sharply, "Whose dog is this?" I wiped my tears and stood up, my voice shaking but strong. "He's mine. They stole him from me," I said, pointing right at Mr. Fields and Mrs. Green, who were now standing frozen like statues. Mr. Blake quickly handed over his phone, showing the video of Mr. Fields trying to shove Buddy into his car. "We've got everything on video, officer," Mr. Blake said calmly, but you could hear the anger in his voice. Mrs. Green tried to lie her way out, saying, "No." The dog was dangerous. We were protecting the community. But Ms. Carter stepped in, glaring at them. "That's a lie. Buddy never hurt anyone. You just hate him because he's a big dog." As the officers started questioning them, Mr. Field got angrier and began shouting, "This is harassment. The HOA has rules, and we were following them." But the police didn't buy it. "You're not above the law," one officer said. They called animal control to check Buddy and make sure he wasn't harmed. I hugged Buddy tighter, whispering over and over, "You're safe now, I've got you." Watching Mr. Fields and Mrs. Green get handcuffed was like a dream. I had never thought I'd see them pay for what they did. But even as they were led away, Mr. Fields turned to me with a sneer and hissed, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I stood tall, knowing I had Buddy back. Still, deep inside, I wondered what he meant. What else could they do? Would the HOA come after me again? As the night grew quieter and the police cars drove off, Miss Carter turned to me and said, "We'll make sure they don't get away with this." Mr. Blake nodded, adding, "But we need to be ready. The HOA is going to fight back hard." I looked down at Buddy, who was now leaning against me. Finally calm. "Let them try," I whispered. "We'll fight harder." The next few weeks were like living in a storm I couldn't escape. Even though Buddy was finally home, safe and sound, I could still feel the shadow of the HOA hanging over us. Every time I stepped outside, I saw people whispering, some looking away, others glaring like I had done something wrong. But there were also neighbors who smiled and gave me secret thumbs up, like they were proud of me for standing up to the bullies. Buddy stayed close to me wherever I went, never letting me out of sight, as if he was scared I might disappear too. Meanwhile, Mr. Fields and Mrs. Green were charged with theft and animal cruelty, and they had to go to court. Mr. Blake, Ms. Carter, and I gathered every piece of proof we had, the videos, the text messages, even statement from neighbors who had seen the HOA board threatening people before. I'll never forget the day of the trial. Walking into that courtroom, my heart was pounding like a drum. Mr. Fields sat there with his fancy lawyer, looking smug like he thought he would win. But when the judge saw the videos of them dragging Buddy and trying to stuff him into the trunk, her face turned hard and serious. "You call this community service?" she said, glaring at them. "This is criminal behavior." The best part was when Ms. Carter took the stand and bravely told the whole courtroom about the HOA's secret meetings and unfair rules. The judge listened carefully, then slammed her gavel and said, "I'm issuing a restraining order. You are forbidden from coming near Buddy or his owner ever again." Tears filled my eyes as I held Buddy's leash tight, finally feeling like we were safe. But that wasn't all. The judge also demanded a full investigation into the HOA board, and soon after, Mr. Fields and Mrs. Green were kicked out of the HOA completely. The whole neighborhood was buzzing. People who had been too scared to speak up before were now holding meetings, demanding fair treatment, and even talking about electing a new board. I never thought I'd be part of something so big, but standing up for Buddy had given me a voice, and I wasn't about to stay quiet ever again. As Buddy and I walked home that day, the sun shining down, and neighbors waving at us, I looked down at him and smiled. "We did it, Buddy," I whispered. "They'll never take you away again." And as he wagged his tail and nudged my hand, I knew that no matter what the HOA tried in the future, we were ready. Because together, we were stronger than anything they could throw at us. If you've ever dealt with an unfair HOA, or someone tried to take away what you love most, like they tried to take Buddy from me, then you know how hard it can be to fight back. But sometimes, standing up for what's right is the only choice we have. What would you do if your HOA came after your dog or family? Let me know in the comments. And if you think Buddy deserved a treat for being so brave, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild HOA and revenge stories. You never know, your story might be next.